The point I want to make today is that Wilhelm Reich is a person who does not only play a role in the history of psychology, psychoanalysis or body psychotherapy, but he plays a lesser-known political role in the 1920s and 1930s in two cities that were both crucial spots for the political clashes between communism and fascism in the interwar years. This part of Wilhelm Reich's life story is usually condensed into a few sentences, stating that he was committed against fascism in the 1930s, and that he wrote a pivotal pamphlet about the mass psychology of fascism, but then left the Communist Party in 1933 and never looked back. The perspective I want to offer you is more elaborate than that. There is more to know about Wilhelm Reich and his political entanglements, but the ability to put facts and events into a proper historical context has up to now been very limited. I want to just say briefly that, as most of you know, Wilhelm Reich came to Vienna as a discharged officer at the end of the First World War in 1918, without any means for survival except his military salary and some privileges connected to his status as a war veteran. Options for studying medicine were open to him. He met Sigmund Freud for the first time as a medical student in 1919, and Freud took a liking to him. He helped Reich already during his study days by sending him patients before he had finished his medical degree. And Reich was to become one of the most famous of Freud's pupils, and certainly the most controversial one. Vienna was at this time a social democratic city and municipality, and the pre-war conservatism was swept away during the war and replaced with modern systems of free education and free healthcare institutions. And this greatly helped the expanding profession of psychoanalysis, which was considered part and parcel of the socialist city, Red Vienna. So, Reich quickly rose to fame in Freud's professional circuit, and by 1925, when this picture is taken, he was a successful MD with his own psychiatric practice. He was a promising pupil of Sigmund Freud, one of the world's most famous psychiatrists, whose reputation and influence was growing by the minute. He was an acknowledged author of scientific papers and a monograph on the impulsive character, which even today is regarded as a path-breaking study on borderline personalities. Here is that book from 1925. But the ending of the Great War coincided roughly with the Russian Revolution, and to millions of people around the world, the two events were related. The Great War was believed to be the ending of the old world with its aristocracy, diplomats, capitalists dividing the world into markets and labor slaves, and eventually leading the world to war. The revolution was the beginning of a new world with just distribution, production for society and not individuals, and the prospect of world peace. It was a new inspiring hope for a whole generation. Oh, it was violent, yes, but less violent than the Great War. And it was a violence that was aiming for a just society without war. Reich was originally a member of the Social Democratic Party of Vienna, just like many of the other psychoanalysts. But he was radicalized in 1927. The 15th of July in 1927, there was a public uprising in Vienna, leading to mass riots and the burning of the Palace of Justice. The uprising was due to three fascist killers who had they had been shooting into a social democratic demonstration some months earlier, and this day They were acquitted for killing an old handicapped war veteran and a young child. The public was so enraged by this acquittal that riots erupted and 80 people were killed and over 100 wounded. So Reich became a member of the Vienna Communist Party, and he made connection with this woman, Maria Frischauff Pappenheim. She was a medical doctor, a socialist, 15 years older than Reich, and a very strong personality. She was one of the first female medical doctors educated at the University of Vienna, a blonde and blue-eyed socialist and feminist from the Viennese educated spheres. She was known as a poet, and her early poetry had been published by the legendary editor Karl Kraus in Die Fackel. Her poetry also caught the attention of world-famous composer Arnold Schoenberg, who fell in love with her. She had met Schoenberg, Alban Berg, and Anton Webern in the summer of 1909, and Schoenberg had asked her to write a libretto for one of his compositions. After the Russian Revolution, she was one of the founders of the Austrian Communist Party. Wilhelm Reich and Maria Frischauff Pappenheim established some of the first sexual clinics in the world in Vienna. In the recently published History of Vienna, her work with Wilhelm Reich is noted as founder of some of the world's first sexual clinics. Clinics that provided free contraceptives, advice on birth control, and similar matters. She also published a book with Wilhelm Reich's wife, Annie Reich, a pamphlet called Is Sexual Abstinence Dangerous?, published through the Münster Verlag, of which we shall hear more in a moment. Reich frequently discussed politics with Freud during this phase of political radicalization, and eventually Freud published his counter-arguments against Reich in his little pamphlet, Civilization and Its Discontents, in 1929. The same year, Reich went to the Soviet Union for the first time, and the visit did not dampen his communist conviction or commitment. He later noted that he dreamed at the time of being the Marx of psychoanalysis. During his collaboration with Maria Frischauff, Reich wrote his own pamphlet, Sexualerregung und Sexualbefriedigung, published by Münster Verlag in 1929 in a total print run of more than 10,000 copies through 4 editions. The next year, in 1930, he published another pamphlet under the same imprint. These 2 pamphlets were later turned into Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution. Today we know that the Münster Verlag was part of a branch of communist propaganda activities financed through Comintern propaganda budgets. Its director was Arnold Deutsch, born in 1904, and we do not know his exact date of his death. We believe it was late 1930s or early 1940s. Deutsch had graduated from the University of Vienna in 1928 with a PhD with distinction in chemistry. Along with his chemistry studies, he had also studied philosophy and psychology. Immediately after graduation, he was recruited as an agent of OMS, the Comintern's liaison department. KGB historians Vladimir Mitrokin and Christopher Andrew from Cambridge note that Deutsch became publicly involved in Wilhelm Reich's Sexpol organization at the same time as he was recruited by the OMS. In Vienna, Christopher Andrew discovered secret police files on Deutsch where his relation to Reich's Sexpol organization was noted. However, the Austrian police did not know about his relation to OMS and the NKVD, which was the name for the KGB at the time. Wilhelm Reich was 5 years older than Deutsch, and how they got in contact we do not know. But we do know that Deutsch was devoted to Reich's ideas of sexual liberation, and in fact, in his later recruitment of agents for the NKVD, he used Reich's ideas of sexuality to great effect as talking points. In a bonding strategy towards young students in Europe frustrated with the widespread sexual repression at university campuses. Mitrokhin and Andrew devote a whole chapter to Arnold Deutsch in the history of the KGB. Because this man is actually one of the greatest recruiters for the KGB that ever lived. Millions of dollars have been spent to find the identity of this man, because for many decades nobody knew who were the actual recruiter of the most famous spies in the history of intelligence, namely the 5 Cambridge spies, with Kim Philby as the most famous. Arnold Deutsch is called the greatest spy catcher of the century. Here we see 4 of the 5 Cambridge spies, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, and Anthony Blunt. 3 of these were central in British and also collaborating with American intelligence way into the 60s, when they were revealed to be Soviet spies. The one to the far right is Anthony Blunt, who was the British Queen's advisor on art. So, the Soviet intelligence service was at this time like the mother of all intelligence services. They were far ahead of most others. And contrary to other national intelligence services, communist parties were existing in every country, so that you didn't have to have national spies. You could recruit in the local countries. And many of the greatest spies in the history of the KGB had the thing in common that they were Galician Jews, mostly from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or later located in the area of Vienna. Another one, this is Reich's pamphlet issued on Arnold Deutsch's publishing house. Now, the KGB historians Mitrokhin and Andrew knew about the relation between Deutsch and Reich, but they did not know that Reich was, in fact, a Communist Party member and already connected with the Communist Party. It is entirely conceivable that Reich was, in fact, the link between Deutsch and the Communist Party, but that we do not know. As I said, in the NKVD, Deutsch proposed a strategy of recruiting young radical students in Western countries for the NKVD, a strategy that met approval from Moscow. He focused his attention on British elite universities, Oxford and Cambridge, and he settled for Cambridge. Reich's theories of sexual oppression in modern society would fit the interest and enthusiasm of young Cambridge scholars in the 1930s. The Cambridge atmosphere concerning sexual matters was not liberal. If a scholar was caught with a girl in his room, the question was not whether to expel him or not, but for how long, if not permanently. Homosexual activity would cause a permanent expulsion if discovered. The writings of D.H. Lawrence express the extent to which sexual liberation was a crucial idea for the generation of Cambridge scholars growing up after the First World War. Reich's theories, stemming from Freud but accentuating the beneficial medical effect of a liberated genital sexuality, were relatively unique in discussing these matters on an intellectual level, matching the tastes of the Cambridge Five. They all rebelled against the Puritanism of interwar Britain. Burgess and Blunt were homosexuals, Maclean a bisexual, and Philby a heterosexual athlete. Another woman, Arnold Deutsch worked together with the Soviet intelligence general Alexander Orlov, and also one other contact, one other intelligence agent working in Britain. And we have now discovered that this was one of his collaborators. She's called Edith Tudor Hart, but she was originally called Edith Sushitsky. From Vienna originally, but she married Alex Tudor Hart and moved to Britain, where she played a role in recruiting the Cambridge Five. She was a photographer, well known for capturing the misery of the working masses in these decades. This is a few of her photographs. She is represented in the National Gallery in England. Tudor Hart, Tudor hyphen H-R-R-T, H-A-R-T. This is an intelligence report from 1965 where they're sort of beginning to figure out some of her pseudonyms and some of her biographical details. This is one of the photographs from Vienna. And here she is with Wilhelm Reich and his wife Annie in Vienna in the 1920s. So, although we now know that there were close links between Wilhelm Reich and some central NKVD agents, this in itself does not prove that Reich was part of the NKVD. Reich may of course have been completely unaware of Deutsch's link to the Russian intelligence organization, although I have to say I find it very unlikely. However, we may start the other way around and ask who was indeed the main Comintern operative in Western Europe at the time, the one who was responsible for the money funding the Münster Verlag, and is there any possible link between Reich and him? We will find that there is indeed such a link. Today we know that Reich had a close and significant long-term connection to one of the most secretive and important Comintern representatives, a man whose various false identities and names made even his wife through over 25 years uncertain of his real name. FBI agents under direct orders from J. Edgar Hoover tried to decipher his true identity and history as late as in 1966, 11 years after his death. It is only recently, through a gradual accumulation of bits and pieces of declassified evidence, that Reich's connection to this enigmatic character may be reconstructed. In the Comintern, he went under the nickname Comrade Thomas, and few knew him under any other name. He took part in the 1917 Russian Revolution and had a high and entrusted position among such central revolutionaries as Lenin, Nikolai Bukharin, Leon Trotsky, Vladimir Zinoviev, and Karl Radek. He was part of the small group of revolutionaries that actually first conceived of a communist international, becoming one of the first representatives of its executive board. Lenin personally appointed him head of Comintern's Berlin office, which was tantamount to being in charge of and overseeing the finances of all of Comintern's Western European activities. Thomas Rubinstein was a pseudonym, one of his many. When he eventually applied for permanent residency and naturalized citizenship in the United States in 1938, he used the name Arnold Rubinstein, under which he lived for the rest of his life. His passport upon arrival in the US was one of the ironclad documents prepared by the NKVD, their favorite term for passports so well faked that they would never be exposed as frauds. A Russian double agent who worked for the FBI on several occasions, notified the FBI in 1966 that he knew that Comrade Thomas had lived in New York. By that time, Rubinstein was already dead, but FBI immediately sent 2 agents to his surviving wife to interview her about the real identity and life story of Comrade Thomas. When the 2 FBI agents turned up at the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the surviving wife of Comrade Thomas turned out to be the psychoanalyst Annie Reich, Wilhelm Reich's first wife. She had left Reich for Comrade Thomas in Berlin in 1933. Much of Comrade Thomas' activities had to do with publishing and distributing books. Books were the prime focus for propaganda purposes, and substantial print runs for reaching mass audiences. That was a clear strategy. The Comintern funding he provided would then explain why Reich suddenly started publishing his books through other channels than a psychoanalytic press. In fact, why he could form his own press in 1932, and why his books reached print runs of tens of thousands of copies. Now, as Wilhelm Reich and Annie Reich had moved to Berlin in 1930, Wilhelm Reich joined the German Communist Party the same year as part of a cell in the Berlin-Wilmersdorf district, Rote Block, which counted members like Gustav Regler and Arthur Koestler. They were, according to Koestler, selling the world revolution like vacuum cleaners. And in this year, in 1933, Reich publishes his most famous political work, The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Now, how could psychoanalysis and a theory of sexuality be relevant for a study of politics? By calling his book Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich hooked onto a tradition from Gustave Le Bon and Freud, who had both written about how being a part of a group may, and often will, reduce or blot out the critical faculties in favor of a group spirit. Freud showed how groups reducing individuality in favor of conformism and collective action could easily be prodded by negative transferences, demonizing the competing group while elevating the in-group in heroic language. In September 1933, obviously at the height of his creative powers, because he published 2 books this year, Character Analysis and Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich published his second book in September. This was the first Freudian contribution to the understanding of fascism, and Reich took as his starting point the political landslide of the Nazi party, NSDAP, after the financial crisis of 1929, because then the NSDAP jumped from 800,000 voters in 1928 to 6.4 million in 1930, 2 years later. And again, increasing from 6.4 million in 1930 to 13 million in 1932, and 17 million voters in 1933. As the strong voter base of the Nazi party was in the lower middle class, Reich pointed out that analyses of the family structure in this social layer showed a markedly more authoritarian attitude. Employing Freudian insights, Reich claimed that the lower middle class suffered from a peculiar ambivalence to authority, often experienced in therapy. They reacted to authority with a mix of rebellion and submission. While often boasting a rebel attitude, in reality they consistently reacted to authority with servility. Reich pointed to how the lower middle class as a social group and their child rearing put a strong emphasis on obedience to authority. He showed how the specific nature of fascism seemed to appeal to specific traits he had found in patients from lower middle class strata, especially males. These would often have anal sadistic traits, being drawn to cleanliness, strictness, and frugality, while unconsciously having forbidden sexual thoughts. Ideologically, Reich argued that fascism was systematically self-contradictory, but gained strength from being perceived as, among the masses, as a liberating political force, fitting both their yearning for rebellion and their deeply ingrained submissiveness. Nazi ideology worked at an unconscious level, sealing the bond between the masses and the leaders, while at the same time giving outlet for their frustrations and their hatred, coming across as a revolutionary ideology. The Nazis exploited sexual emotions in the masses during their rallies, while at the same time attacking opponents as immoral. Reich pointed to the anal sadistic level of the Nazi ideology connected to cleanliness and dirt of their opponents, as well as stirring up unconscious images both of masochistic submissiveness towards the leader and permitted violence against the enemy. The rhetoric was full of moralistic and Puritan notions, the purity of the Aryan race, the filthy Jews, etc., and at the same time gave free rein to irrational and sexual emotions on a subconscious level. Reich mentions the Nazi youth organizations, which under slogans of Aryan purity and chasteness, in reality encouraged sexual relations and thereby attracted thousands of young people lacking other opportunities for coupling. I've chosen this poster from Nazi propaganda in the 30s. It is not used by Reich, but I think it illustrates many of his major points. Let's have a look at this. Where's the pointer, by the way? The laser pointer? Yeah. Oh, that was not what I had in mind. Yeah. It's back on, good. This is where, yeah. Okay. I think we have a lot of stuff going on here. This is a very pure and chaste and clean and beautiful German Nazi girl. And if we have a look at some of the, it's very common in kind of subliminal reading of propaganda to find sort of hidden sexual imagery. A common theme is like items that could be read as phallic in structure, reaching towards areas that could be subliminally read as a genital female area, right? The Nazi button here looks like a nipple. If you look at this scarf, you can see that this actually looks like a Jewish face, the kind of racist stereotype of a Jewish face. And this was something Reich was very concerned with, how it was always a question of blonde white women and the filthiness of the Jews or the blacks. He compared the Nazi rhetoric, the anti-Semitic rhetoric, with typical Southern stereotypes in the United States against blacks. So the black, dirty, filthy against the white, pure, beautiful young girl. Also, she's holding this black pole. Holding a black pole is also kind of a stereotype. So this little poster illustrates many of Reich's points in the mass psychology of fascism. Now let's see if I can stick this back on. Am I too close to this microphone, or is it okay? Good. It's good, good. Reich even gives an original analysis of the swastika as an archaic sexual symbol, fertility symbol, and argues that it depicts a couple in the sexual act, with the heads here. So the Nazis thus actively employed sexuality as a political force in propaganda and in recruitment. The communist youth organizations, on the other hand, expressed liberal sexual views, but did not attract many members due to the tedious discussions about economy and similar topics. Yes. I interviewed a man called Norbert Ernst, who had been a young communist in the 1930s in Germany. And he told me that he had escaped from Germany in 1934 and became one of Reich's assistants in Oslo. He stated that he and like-minded members of the Communist Party saw Reich and Trotsky as two of the few communists daring to criticize Stalin. So he smuggled Reich's books into Germany after 1933 with false jacket covers after they had been banned. One of these false covered versions have now been found. The cover bears the title Mystical Elevation, a book for young men by Pastor Friedrich Traub. And the first page of the book, most probably written by Reich, is a glowing text about the need for Christian submission to the strong leadership of the Führer and the joy that will follow from this submission, until on the next page it abruptly passes over into Massa Culture of Fascism. So considered a dangerous and important book, it went into 3 print runs in the first year and was secretly distributed in Germany. In his memoirs, the later staunch anti-communist Arthur Koestler, who had belonged to the same communist cell as Wilhelm Reich in Berlin, he noted approvingly that Reich saw the dictatorial tendencies in the Soviet Union long before he himself did. Reich was always concerned with sexuality as a yardstick of a society's reactionary, liberal, or revolutionary state of being. He sided with the early Freud in claiming that all neuroses had a sexual component and that the widespread mental problems were related to a sexually repressive society. All societies in history have aimed at keeping sexuality under control in various forms and to various degrees, Reich claimed, but nothing is a surer sign of an authoritarian society than rigid sexual repression. The link between sexuality and left-wing politics was basically nothing new. Especially the British Romantic revolutionaries combined political heroism with a libertine ethos, as is seen in the writings of, for instance, Lord Byron or Shelley. Being close to the events in Germany and seeing how the Communist Party had not succeeded in preventing the rise of Hitler, Reich did not accept decrees from Moscow, in many cases without much knowledge about the local problems, stating that Hitler's victory was only a temporary setback for the Communist Party. In the opening paragraph of Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich stated that the communists had suffered a great defeat. But then reactions came quite quickly, and he was soon expelled from the party in Germany. Now, as the power struggle between Stalin and Trotsky arose in the Soviet Union, many Western European communists saw Stalin as a symbol of a reactionary setback in the communist state, while Trotsky was an intellectual force from the old Soviet vanguard, now living abroad, who might give rise to a new international revolutionary movement. Those disagreeing with that view saw Stalin as the one who had to secure the revolution and Trotsky as a possible fifth columnist, stirring up trouble for the Soviet Union abroad. For Reich, a change of society away from the patriarch family tradition was a very important factor in measuring a society's level of saneness. And the Soviet Union had indeed aimed at changing society's family structure in a more social direction in sexual matters. The Soviet Union put a ban on prostitution, it legalized abortion, and discarded the ban on homosexuality. To Reich, as to many others in his generation, these were expressions of a more rational and just society in one of the most important spheres of life. According to Reich, traditional family structures bred neuroses on a mass scale, while the Soviet Union seemed to do away with traditional patriarchy just as it had done away with feudal aristocracy. As Stalin entered the scene, however, the Soviet Union changed back to more traditional family structures, as well as commencing on a mass worship of the leader that to Reich uncannily resembled the Hitler cult in Germany he had described in Mass Psychology of Fascism. Trotsky was at the time vehemently attacking Stalin in articles and books, describing him with a combination of disgust and contempt as an enemy of the people and a dictator. Trotsky had lost the power struggle with Stalin in Russia and was expelled from the Soviet Union and living abroad. Stalin, for his part, orchestrated furious accusations against Trotsky, claiming he was an enemy of the revolution and of the Russian fatherland, and that he was collaborating with other nations conspiring against Russia. Being a supporter of Trotsky would soon become very dangerous. But in October 1933, Reich wrote a long letter to Trotsky informing him of his sexual political work in Germany. "I am a psychoanalyst," he wrote, "medical doctor and a pupil of Freud, and have organized the communist sexual political movement in Germany since 1931. Reich's letter caught Trotsky's interest. Already in the 1920s, Trotsky had expressed interest in psychoanalysis and had defended Freud over and against the Russian psychologist Pavlov in his book Fragen des Alltagsleben from 1923. In a public lecture in Copenhagen in 1932, which would prove to be his last public lecture, Trotsky had in passing praised Freud and psychoanalysis for having opened the lid of what poetically is called the soul of man. Reich informed Trotsky of a sexual political project and his views of how this may give insight to the reactionary tendencies in the Soviet Union. He wrote, I quote, "The sexual, I'll skip that, let's see. Oh, I need a bit more. Reich pointed out in his sex political work for the party, the everyday problems of youth, mostly sexual, were employed in the political recruitment process. He further informed Trotsky that the leaders of the Communist Party were skeptical of his sex politics and that he feared expulsion from the party. Following the activities of the Trotskyite left opposition closely, Reich now requested support and possible collaboration in case a new party would be formed in Germany. Trotsky replied in a letter where he admitted to being largely ignorant about the questions Reich raised, but he had received Mass Psychology of Fascism and wrote, quote, "The general importance of sexual problems for the education of working class youth I am obviously unfamiliar with, and I would very much like to be further informed about your views, experience and plans in this field. I need not say that your proposed close contact seems highly desirable to me, and I do hope that it will not only remain on a personal level." In a letter to Trotsky dated 28th of March 1934, Reich informed him that the group of expelled Marxist sex politicians had met with members of Trotsky's organization in Paris for what turned out to be a fruitful exchange. Reich moved to Norway in October 1934. His common-law wife, Elsa Lindenberg, who was a dancer, said, I quote, "Everywhere Reich went, there would be politics. I was part of a small group who had staged a cabaret, and before I invited Reich, he had to promise me that he'd just sit and watch the show, not to try to agitate or whatever. Yes, of course, he said, and on the premiere, he came with a cup of coffee and sat quietly in his chair and watched for a while. But then we did a number on Italian fascism. He rose from his chair, came running towards the stage, and leapt like a lion onto it. It was an impressive leap, the stage was high, and he joined in the show, parading and did a marvelous Mussolini impersonation. Unquote. Now, in 1935, Trotsky too arrived in Norway, having been granted political asylum there, and Reich renewed the contact. He was clearly aware that a meeting with Trotsky would have to be a matter of utmost secrecy, as it could potentially be extremely dangerous. Elsa Lindberg recalls, "He was away for days, and I was instructed by him never to mention Trotsky's name ever. Not in conversations or discussions, never mention his name. I had a feeling it was Trotsky he meant on those occasions." Trotsky was at this point working on the book called The Revolution Betrayed, about Stalin, while Reich had written a manuscript along the same lines called The Masses and the State, a bitter evaluation of the recent development in the Soviet Union under Stalin. Eventually, Reich and Trotsky did meet on several occasions between March and April 1936. A Berlin-based psychiatrist connected to Trotsky's group called Erwin Akkerknecht had a great respect for Reich and had recommended him to Trotsky. During his visit, Reich and Trotsky discussed the situation in the Soviet Union, the future of communism, as well as the possibility of changing the authoritarian line under Stalin. Reich informed Trotsky about how his experiences with psychoanalytic therapy and sexual theory had made him alert to signs of authoritarianism that always went hand in hand with sexual repression. Trotsky pointed out that Reich's mass psychological explanation of Soviet family and sexual policies was insufficient. The low production rates and ensuing social misery in the Soviet Union in the immediate years after the revolution was an important part of the background to the family policies of the Soviet Communist Party. However, Trotsky's respect for Freudian psychoanalysis and Reich's clear proficiency both as a pupil of Freud and writer in his own right — after all, no other psychoanalyst had written an analysis of fascism — all probably contributed to make Trotsky regard Reich as an important ally. Several of Reich's ideas at least partly made their way into Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky posted the manuscript of the book to the publisher in July 1936. Stalin had, through his agents, already secured copies of the manuscript, and the book sent Stalin into a rage. The forces that were soon to be unleashed were of a kind the world had not witnessed before. On 14th of August 1936, TASS News reported that's the Soviet news agency, TASS News, reported that 16 people were charged with high treason and the murder of Sergei Kirov, amongst them Leon Trotsky and his son Leo Sedov, in absentia. On 19th of August, the Moscow trials began. These trials were a catastrophe for all socialists and communists who had believed naively in a possible democratic development of the Soviet state. When the execution pelotons soon were put to work in Soviet Russia, the gravity of the situation dawned on everyone. On the 30th of August 1936, the Russian ambassador in Oslo, Maxim Litvinov, handed over an extradition request to the Norwegian government for having Trotsky released to Russian authorities. Stalin put further pressure on Norway by raising import tariffs on Norwegian fish. Hence, Norwegian exports to Russia fell markedly during Trotsky's stay. Quick measures had to be taken, as the Labour government had to solve the Trotsky issue before the general election in October. Trotsky was thus sent to Mexico, where he was later killed by one of Stalin's agents. At this time, among communists and Soviet sympathizers, being a Trotskyite was soon synonymous with being an enemy of the revolution and of the Soviet Union. Also, it often implied being a collaborator with the Nazis. In fact, effectively being worse. It was worse than being a Nazi. Wilhelm Reich was quickly put in this category also on official levels. On the 2nd September 1936, a memorandum marked top secret was dispatched from the NKVD to Georgy Dimitrov, leader of the Comintern Eki Bureau, containing a list of Trotskyites and other hostile elements in the refugee community of the German Communist Party. In this document, Wilhelm Reich is identified as a well-known Trotskyite. The document was sure to be spread in all countries where the East Germans stayed, so from then on, Reich was put in a dangerous position. The second wave, the second of the Moscow trials, started in January 1937 and showed that Stalin had by now installed a true reign of arbitrary power and terror. The executions first ran up to 20-30 people, then ran into their hundreds, thousands, then hundreds of thousands. In all, it is estimated that nearly 1 million people were executed during Stalin's Great Terror of 1936 to 1938. Supporters of Stalin claimed at the time that he only killed a fifth column of collaborators and traitors trying to betray Russia to Germany. Others were disgusted and vaccinated against communism for good. Wilhelm Reich was one of the many belonging to the latter category, after 11 years of zealous and committed support for the cause. In the years that followed, Stalin's rage and willingness to execute Trotskyites not only at home in the Soviet Union, but also abroad, was apparent to anyone with knowledge about Trotsky's circuits. He also sent professional execution squads to Western Europe to liquidate former party members, agents if they had connections with Trotsky or sympathies for him, and friends of Trotsky. Erwin Wolf, one of those who had recommended Reich to Trotsky and had been one of Trotsky's secretaries, was killed in Barcelona by Stalin's agents on 13 September 1937. Trotsky's son, Leo Sedov, was killed in a hospital in France in February 1938. The corpse of the German Trotskyite Rudolf Clement, probably the one that Reich had met in Paris, was thrown decapitated and without legs into the Seine in Paris. He had been killed by the NKVD on 13th of July 1938. And Trotsky himself was killed by an NKVD agent in Mexico in 1940. Heinz Epe, who had been present at Reich's meeting with Trotsky, Trotsky's secretary that is, went to Sweden with his Norwegian wife Synnøve Knudsen and their little son Ivar Olav Epe, who was 5 years old. Synnøve's father had managed to escape to the United States via the Soviet Union in 1941, having obtained Norwegian citizenship and thus a visa to the US. Heinz Epe believed that he could take the same route. But the three of them were arrested as soon as they entered the Soviet Union. Epe's role as assistant to Trotsky evidently carried enough weight to make his arrest and interrogation a matter of highest importance. The mighty Beria himself questioned him. Epe's wife Synnøve tried in vain to get in touch with him and the authorities, having their little son to take care of, but eventually she was arrested too, along with their son. All three of them died in prison. So in the foreword to the English version of Reich's autobiography, People in Trouble, written first in Norway at this point in 1937, Reich writes, I quote, "Of course, one cannot defend oneself from a shot in the back, but perhaps politicians will be content to refrain from murder if we assure them that we do not intend to compete with them for power and that we shall cede to them the field of demagoguery completely, limiting ourselves to work with hapless victims. I hope I've made myself perfectly clear." Unquote. From 1937, Wilhelm Reich lived with fear for his own life. So, if we now have a look at the trajectory I've followed you through, you'll see that I've tried to put Wilhelm Reich into a political context of his generation, taking place around him in Vienna and Berlin, which included a number of secret networks. In this case, we've shown direct personal and professional contact between Reich and at least two, probably three, of the most legendary and mythical intelligence officers of the Comintern and the KGB. We have shown how Wilhelm Reich fits into a pattern of shared background traits and specifics of the most famous Western KGB intelligence operators at the time, being Galician Jews born around the turn of the century, university educated and trained in secret intelligence work, drawn to communism of Trotsky against that of Stalin. This network was basically wiped out in the years between 1934 and 1938. The survivors were all fiercely against communism from then on, and this background is what made Reich call communism under Stalin red fascism. Wilhelm Reich had a complicated life, but he went through some of the 20th century's worst conflicts at a closer range than most people are aware. I hope this has contributed to your understanding of Wilhelm Reich and his political engagement in the interwar years. Thank you for your attention and for inviting me here. I'm sorry I went